Okay. Well, good afternoon. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I'd like to welcome you to our event today entitled China and Afghanistan-Pakistan Region, Competition or Cooperation? If you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute, we are an action think tank dedicated to pursuing a new foreign policy, primarily based on diplomacy rather than American primacy, military primacy abroad. Through that frame, we're very proud to have a stable of regional experts and advocates for change here in Washington. Please visit our website to find out more about us, about our mission and our immediate goals for foreign policy change. I am going to turn over the reins now to Michael Kugelman, who is the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where he focuses on U.S. relations with Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan. He will be moderating our event today. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to our audience, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly. I appreciate the opportunity to moderate a timely event like this, and especially one with such great panelists who I always enjoy learning from. So thank you to the Quincy Institute and Adam and others. I really appreciate it. Let's get right into it. Our three speakers today are all well known, so I'll keep my introductions brief. Andrew Small is a senior transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Asia program, and he's the author of the China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics, which I think is one of the best books on Asian geopolitics to have come out over the last decade or so. It was published in 2015. Ammara Durrani is a senior research fellow at the Jinnah Institute in Islamabad. She also teaches political economy and public policy in Pakistan at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad, and she previously held senior positions with UNDP and USAID, among other places. Is a research fellow with the Quincy Institute, also American Pakistan Foundation Council. Adam's also a U.S. Marine, deployed to Afghanistan in 2012. So let's get right to it. There will not be any opening remarks, and I'll just start by posing a few questions to the panelists. We'll have a discussion, and if you are in the audience and would like to pose a question, you could just post it in the Q&A box, and we'll get to your question as we go. So let's to you first. Very quick snapshot of where things stand right now with Chinese investments in Pakistan and Afghanistan. CPEC appears to have lost some momentum in Pakistan, whereas China long ago in Afghanistan due to the war, and it doesn't really appear to be much of a player in terms of investments right now. So what's your read on how things look? Is there still ample Chinese investment in Pakistan outside of the sea? And is there any type of Chinese investment activity going on in Afghanistan right now? So Andrew, I let you go ahead.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to the Quincy Institute for the chance to join this discussion. Thanks, Michael, also for your extraordinarily kind introduction. So, I mean, this picture looks very different in Pakistan and Afghanistan. As you suggested, Michael, there was a point, and there are points even now where people still claim that China is Afghanistan's largest investor, largely because of the dollar figures attached to the INAC copper mine. In practice, of course, all the major investments in Afghanistan turned out to be stalled. The oil investments in the north and the copper mine itself. I think it's now essentially inaccurate to make that statement anymore. But the question on Afghanistan had rather been looking forward at aftermath scenarios to a peace settlement and things. Is there a case in which China could swing in a more significant way? There'd been a lot of talk about kind of a peace dividend and China's willingness as one of the only investors who's willing to take certain of those sorts of risks that it might come in. And given the context we're dealing with the Afghan peace process at the moment, that's something that I think will come back to the discussion again. But there too, I actually think China's been more risk averse in its thinking on that in the last 2 or 3 years, and particularly, but not only as a result of US-China dynamics, also its assessment of the situation in Afghanistan. Pakistan's situation is wildly different. There are large dollar sums attached to the investments that China has put there. Yes, they're substantially smaller than I think some of the initial projections that there were, but I think when CPEC launched, if you'd said, looking at the history of the China-Pakistan economic relationship, that you'd have $19 billion, $25 billion worth of investments coming in from China, I think you'd have said, you know, that really is a shift change. And they have stalled, I think, to a significant extent in the last few years. We're at this kind of juncture at the moment where we may see another takeoff. Again, they have moved forward a little bit after a period since late 2017 where they had significantly slowed down. There are also some other non-CPEC investments that have some weight too, the nuclear power plants, a couple of other areas. The relationship of old was a very, very weak economic and investment relationship. So we are in a different phase with this. We have seen some progress, particularly on the energy investments that comprise the largest part of CPEC. But I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion now. We're at this point where it may well be that they've kind of topped out to a certain extent, or we may get at least a kind of leaning forward, slight revival of CPEC. A couple of the large investments like the ML1 railway line, a couple of other hydroelectric plants that are in the offing again. But we still have at around $25 billion versus what we saw a few years earlier, a big jump forward really in terms of the level of Chinese economic presence in Pakistan at least.
Thank you. That's a great start, a great overview. Ammara, why don't we go to you? Following on what Andrew had to say about CPEC, how would you say CPEC is viewed in Islamabad these days? How would you articulate the Pakistani perspectives of the project at this juncture? How much of a priority does it remain for the government? And in terms of Chinese investment in Pakistan more broadly, outside of the CPEC rubric, if you could give your sense of where that stands, how much of a priority that is for Islamabad. So Ammara, I look forward to hearing from you now.
Michael, thank you, and my thanks to the Quincy Institute for giving me this opportunity to be part of this fantastic panel on a very topical and timely subject. I broadly agree with Andrew's observations vis-a-vis China's hedging and risk-averse behavior in Afghanistan. However, I slightly have a different view from Andrew vis-a-vis China's positioning and forward movements in Pakistan. I think there are a couple of important factors that need to be calibrated in understanding that if in the international media there may be a perception that perhaps CPEC has stalled, that is not my view from the ground. I think two most important factors that need to be factored in is first that China has had to adjust to a change of government in Pakistan. The CPEC momentum continued over two consecutive governments from 2013 onwards, and the current government is vastly different from the previous two governments in their approach and having their own very strong economic revival agenda. And I think China has had to cover some ground on establishing a working relationship and chemistry and understanding with the current PTI government that is in place in federal and three of the major provinces which are of immediate relevance to CPEC. One. Second, I think COVID needs to be acknowledged and the extremely disruptive impact it has had on frontline economies like Pakistan, where so much has been at stake, and the kind of weak economic indicators that the current government inherited and the immediate economic crisis management that it has had to put itself in, where CPEC became, kind of a secondary thought. The first crisis that this government has had to manage was the balance of payments crisis, and it is still, navigating that. Now, in that context, the COVID and the change of government and the balance of payment crisis, I think some important progress indicators are that there's a lot of systemic ground that has been covered on CPEC legislation, needed legislation, some level of greater partnership between the civilian and the military establishments in Pakistan on how to manage the relationship with China and CPEC, and really pushing forward phase two, how to transition from phase one to phase two and really start demonstrating results of CPEC, which I think is the biggest pressure for this government. So I think in this respect, there's a lot of ground momentum that needs to be factored in from domestic, political, economic, and COVID-related prisms.
Well, thanks, Ammara. That's really useful. That's really interesting. Wanted to come to Adam, but first, I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier. Maybe I did. If not, I'll say it again for the audience. As we go along, if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So, Adam, wanted you to speak a bit about the U.S. government views toward Chinese investment in the region, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. Clearly, the Trump administration opposes it, but I think as you all will know, for a number of years, Washington had not expressed any public opposition. There had been no formal public opposition to CPEC or BRI more broadly until Ambassador Alice Wells's address, some would say infamous address at the Wilson Center a year ago, where she offered a very in-depth criticism of it. But now we have a new administration that will soon be taking office that has telegraphed a desire to lower the temperature, at least modestly, on the U.S.-China rivalry and to cooperate in areas where, to quote Joe Biden himself, where areas where our interests converge. So on this front, two questions for you, I guess, Adam. First, why do you think it took so long for the U.S., for the Trump administration to formally take a position, a public formal position in opposition to BRI? Was it just a case of BRI eventually getting caught up in an increasingly toxic U.S.-China rivalry, or something else? And second, sort of look from a more forward-looking perspective, do you think that from the perspective of the incoming Biden administration, the development of infrastructure and connectivity projects to promote trade and stability in South Asia can, in theory, be one of these areas where U.S. and Chinese interests converge?
Thank you, Michael. I think the reason that it didn't come into the spotlight in Washington policy circles, at least in the government, because it was being discussed in the broader policymaking community. But I think the reason is simply that people weren't sure what BRI was. CPEC is often, portrayed as the pilot project of BRI. I think CPEC offers a good example of the strength and shortcomings of the broader BRI project. A lot of the successes in the early harvest phase, or phase one of CPEC, they owe their success to the fact that these projects were already underway, or the groundwork had already been laid by China in Pakistan. And of course, Pakistan was an easy country for China to initiate some of these BRI projects, because China deeply understands the domestic politics of Pakistan in a way that it might not in other countries. It has strong relationships. Granted, China's relationships with political parties in Pakistan were stronger with the PMLN and PPP. They had to form a new relationship with PTI because it hadn't held power before, except in KP. And there, when PTI was in power in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it had a little bit of skepticism about CPEC, because there was, a sense that CPEC might not benefit that province, even though the Chinese assured them that it would. So I think there was a lack of understanding, even within Pakistan, about what CPEC was, let alone in Washington, and definitely what BRI was. And now I think it's come to people's attention, and that's why you have stronger stances on it. I do think it offers an opportunity for cooperation. Much of what the United States criticizes about BRI is valid. The concessionality of the loans is bad. They're exploitative. Many of the projects, offer really incredible headlines, but they don't actually break any ground. And that's even more so true in Afghanistan. but I do think it offers opportunities for cooperation or coordination. And I think it's important to distinguish cooperation from coordination. The US could engage in development initiatives that complement BRI without directly cooperating with the Chinese, and that could improve security and trade in the region. And it's something that would allow an off-ramp to tensions, or to some extent, and I think it would be politically feasible.
Well, thanks. And actually, on that note of distinguishing between coordination and cooperation, I think that's an important point to make. But Andrew, I'll sort of take this issue to you now. And I know that one of the major objectives of this session was to discuss this idea of cooperation / coordination versus competition and so on. What do you think it would take for there to be some type of coordination between China and the US in this context? What factors would need to be in place for one to not simply dismiss the whole idea as a pipe dream? In other words, is it possible to think of the idea of a bitter strategic rivalry like the US-China relationship being in a position to accommodate economic coordination or cooperation, if you want to put it that way? I think we all know that strategic rivals do cooperate or coordinate commercially. We had seen this until relatively recently with India and China, of course. They have, I think, the largest bilateral trade volume of any bilateral trade relationship. So, what would it take? And I think we could afford to be provocative here, because clearly, I think that in the Trump era in Washington, the idea of any type of broader cooperation or convergence between the US and China on these issues would appear to be a non-starter. But looking at this from a more open perspective with a new administration coming to office, is this something that we could even look at as a possibility, this notion of some type of coordination between the two countries? And if so, what would need to be in place?
So I think, a couple of points on this. First of all, South Asia over time, generally speaking, not just the Afghanistan and Pakistan piece of this, had been an area where some areas of cooperation had been possible. And you can go much further back in time, but only if you're only looking at the last decade, stabilizing Afghanistan, particularly through the peace process, which, I think quite notably persisted in different ways through this administration. Khalilzad would go through Beijing. This was not something that just dropped off the agenda, even in the middle of all the other elements of US-China competition. I think there had been, going further back in time, a view on the US side that some level of coordinated economic support to Pakistan was beneficial for stability in the region. It had been something that had been sort of urged on China before. And I think even until sort of a fair way through this administration, I think the view on CPEC was kind of mixed to positively disposed. I don't think it's a surprise in one way that the Alice Wells speech came kind of quite late in the game, in a context in which, in many other regions of the world, the approach and the view on what was going on the BRI was fairly uniformly critical. I think that had always looked slightly different in the South Asian context. But I think it is clear that on most of these counts, and counterterrorism was an area of certain areas of coordination. There are just individuals on the same lists on the Chinese and US sides. It was US drone strikes killing Chinese targets in Pakistan at points. There have been peculiar layers of cooperation that have taken place historically on this. And of course, the Indo-Pak side of things. The two sides had coordinated there too. So it's just been that the hierarchy of concerns in South Asia has looked quite different between the US and China. Cooperation in certain areas has been possible. Competition with each other wasn't necessarily so high on the agenda. I think for reasons that don't just relate to the Trump administration, that's kind of got harder on a number of these different areas, though, and this isn't, and it's not necessarily going to improve quite as quickly as one might expect. Counterterrorism pieces become harder largely because of what's going on in Xinjiang at the moment, which was not in the past. That just bleeds through a lot when it comes to counterterrorism questions right now, and that's not moving. I think this move to think about economics and security in a more integrated way on the US side, which previously I think these things had been seen more in discrete lanes. And I think more of an assessment generally on the BRI that says, I mean, how helpful is what China is doing with some of these investments from a developmental perspective? I think there has been a genuine kind of attempt to assess some of these questions, and that kind of mixed view that you saw, including from very non-political people in the system in the US, has kind of tilted in a more skeptical direction in terms of what they might see resulting from this, including with CPEC. So I think there's just a kind of a more critical view of that, which does make it quite hard, where I think previously the view had been, if China invests in Afghanistan, then that's in some sense or other a good thing. If China puts more money into Pakistan, then that's in some sense or other a good thing. I think that's changed in a way that goes beyond just the dynamics on the US-China relationship that were introduced in the level of intensity that they were with this administration. And I think that will be I'm not sure that will pull back quite as dramatically. I think there's a similar level of skepticism from many people coming in on the Biden side. But having said all of that, I think there will be a sense probably that some of the sort of competition in continental Eurasia versus maritime Asia, I think you can see reasons for just deprioritizing that. I think Afghanistan in particular, again, as to some extent Adam was saying, even if you might not have cooperation, you might not even have coordination, but are you going to have forms of competition or rivalry that are damaging to mutual interests? I think if you can stop that on some of these issues, then that on some of the areas that we're talking about, development agenda, peace process and its aftermath in Afghanistan, some of these sorts of things, that may be sufficient. And I'd be a bit more optimistic about that. I mean, I don't think the US has been trying to kind of thwart CPEC or anything like this. This has been a largely kind of reputational battle that's played out. In some ways, it kind of the kickoff for that was the point at which the US just started taking everything about the Belt and Road more seriously and devoting more critical attention to the thing. And you had the statements from Pompeo well before you had anything from Alice Wells on that ground. And of course, I mean, CPEC is the flagship. It has this special status. It is going to become part of a dynamic between the two sides where there are the reputational battle over these questions is not going to go away. But I think you can expect, and I think it would be easier to expect, that the level of kind of intensity of competition, that this just had to bleed across everything, even on some of these issue areas where the two sides had been sort of at least semi-cooperative in the past. I think you could see that ease somewhat, and go into depth on some of the specific areas on that, even beyond the economic developmental piece of this. But my sense is that does look a little bit more possible than it was.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I think you made a very important, series of really useful points. But the one you made about how China looks at Afghanistan, I think it's an important thing to put out there, that the U.S. and China, there are a number of convergences when it comes in how they look at Afghanistan in terms of both supporting the idea of a more stable Afghanistan, supporting the peace process, and supporting counterterrorism activities against ISIS or whatever the case may be. And it's very striking that not just China, but also Iran and Russia, these are countries that don't get along with the U.S., but they all look at Afghanistan in similar ways that the U.S. does. There are a lot of potential convergences there, but clearly political realities have made it more difficult for them for the U.S. to work with those partners. We'll see if that changes. Hopefully we can get to that. Some great questions that are starting to come into the Q&A box, and I'll start posing them in a bit. I wanted to go to you though, Ammara, just to see if you wanted to add to this, to what Andrew had to say. And also there was an interesting specific question that came in for you earlier, getting to this issue of some of these newer economic and financial institutions the world is starting to see. And there was a specific question about RCEP and if there are any implications for the emergence of that bloc for Pakistan, particularly as it relates to the second phase of CPEC, which of course is meant to emphasize economic free trade zones and so on. So if you wanted to comment on this.
Thank you. I think Andrew has sketched a good paradigm on the conflict versus competition and an overall, cooperative framework between U.S. and China over the last 1 decade. But I want to unpack a couple of points within that context. First, I can't help but notice that Alice Wells' remarks created a storm. But then that storm, this is my view from Islamabad, that storm kind of subsided with her departure. You don't see that kind of intensity in US rhetoric against CPEC these days. At least this is my sense. The other important point that I want to make here is that Alice Wells' statement occurred before the February peace pact between US and Taliban. And I can't help but wonder whether there were clear linkages to that rhetoric with the pressure that Pakistan was facing to do more for Afghanistan peace process. And somehow the February agreement that followed in the following year has helped in abating some of the more antagonistic sting from the Alice Wells narrative. So I think these are two important points that I would like to make. I think there are some clear linkages with the overall US-Pakistan relationship from the perspective of how the Afghanistan endgame has played out. One, and then Adam has made a very important point, and I'd like to play the devil's advocate on that one when he says that somehow perhaps CPEC was not understood in the US. My perspective is that the US has been involved, and Andrew has alluded to that. The US has been involved in regional economic cooperative frameworks going back to the 1990s, the TAPI, the CARIC framework. There's a legacy of regional connectivity and economic cooperation, and the US has been a major actor in those earlier projects. You just have to pick up Ahmed Rashid's books on the Taliban to go into the history of how the TAPI project and the Taliban's role in some of those negotiations and the US role. I think, and this is again my view, I think what happened in the last decade, especially from 2010 onwards, the US got very embroiled in the security and political dimension of the region because of its military engagement in Afghanistan, to the extent that it really lost its focus on how regional political economy was evolving in Pakistan, and how different that evolution was from, say, how the political economy was evolving in Afghanistan. I think one of the key criticisms that came out from Pakistan at that point in time was not to lump AfPak, because there are two different political economies of two different countries, and it would be a mistake to apply a narrow erstwhile Fatah paradigm to the whole of Pakistan, to apply a narrow Afghanistan war paradigm to the whole of Pakistan, because it has its own economic history that predates 9/11. And I think that is where, in my view, the US kind of lost its interest, not sense, but interest. And as it got more and more embroiled in the security and political dimensions of the Afghan war, it just took a conscious decision of not investing in understanding how the country context of Pakistan was changing. And I think that this is where, BRI didn't just fall off from the sky. There was even before 2013, this is a bilateral agreement. And as we all know, as policy practitioners, years go into bilateral negotiations and understanding and homework before such agreements are inked of this magnitude. So this didn't just happen in 2013. There was a lot of homework put in by Islamabad and Beijing in making it through. And I think somehow, because of its over, how should I say, just getting bogged down in Afghanistan, took the US shift away from how the political economic realities in Pakistan and the wider region, including Central Asia, have changed in the last 15, 20 years.
So thank you for that. In a second, I wanted to get Adam's take on what Ammara just had to say. And I had another question for Adam. But I think on this question of CPEC and Washington and how it's perceived here, my own sense is that to a great degree, CPEC did get caught up, and by extension, Pakistan got dragged into a U.S.-China rivalry that was becoming increasingly toxic during the Trump years. And I think it's notable that when Ambassador Wells made that speech, most people remember the first part of it, where she was extremely critical of CPEC and BRI and explained why. But there's been much less focus on the second part of her speech, which actually was talking about how the U.S. government was keen to work with Pakistan and to do more investment there. And she proposed an alternate model that she thought the U.S. government could do better than China could in Pakistan. But I know that that speech and this broader critical sentiment about CPEC in Washington has been perceived by some in Pakistan and elsewhere, I would think, as something that's against Pakistan, whereas it was not. I mean, that sentiment is really expressing concern about the extent of China's investment footprint and what Washington perceives to be a predatory model of investment, to use a term that the U.S. government likes to use. So anyway, Adam, going back to, you're welcome to respond to what Ammara had to say in response to your interesting points, but also going back to Afghanistan, the question that always comes up when we have these conversations about the idea of China expanding the Belt and Road Initiative into Afghanistan, or China stepping up its investment in Afghanistan, or coordinating with the US, or whatever the case may be. If you look at the very basic facts on the ground in Afghanistan, there's a peace process that of course has begun, and there was an agreement on the procedural framework that was concluded today, which is great. But if you look at the trend lines in Afghanistan, things could get a lot worse before they get better. And I think we may not be in a position to be talking about a more stable Afghanistan anytime soon. So in that sense, the question is, are we putting the cart before the horse? If we're talking hypothetically about these ideas for the US and China to try to align their interests, their economic interests, or their investment goals in Afghanistan, is it a conversation that's even worth having at this point of time? So sorry to be provocative, but I just figured I would put that out there.
Well, I think it's definitely worth having because, as Ammara points out, these things take years to develop. So we can have the conversation now, and I don't think we'll see action on the ground for many years to come, but the conversation has to happen first. I remember in Andrew's book, he cites a statement by Deng Xiaoping where he says that he's happy to see the Soviets in a quagmire in Afghanistan and continue to sell weapons that fuel the conflict. I don't think that's China's position now. I think China's happy to see the US have to manage the problems in Afghanistan rather than them, but I think they'd prefer to see a stable Afghanistan. And I do think there's some overlap between the, as Andrew pointed out, the US was killing Chinese targets in drone strikes because they were on both of the country's lists. So I think the Chinese want to see a stable Afghanistan, and the United States wants to see a stable Afghanistan. The question is whether the Chinese are going to want to take the risk of actually engaging in development in the country. And they've had these glamorous projects announced in the past that haven't amounted to anything. But it's definitely worth exploring. To speak to Ammara's earlier points, I think it's definitely true that U.S. policy towards Pakistan, including development, took a back seat to the war in Afghanistan. And it became a situation where Washington was willing to risk turning Pakistan into a pariah state due to its policies in Afghanistan. I don't think that made strategic sense because it's a nuclear power with over 200 million people. And it is a flawed but functioning democracy, albeit with a military that often intervenes, outside of in a way that is not democratic. But I think there was a sense in Washington that U.S. policy towards Pakistan had to be attached to outcomes in Afghanistan, and that was damaging. In terms of Pakistani attitudes towards U.S. alternatives to CPEC, I think the sense, looking from the outside, is that CPEC is the only show in town. And until the US has something better to offer, criticism of CPEC will be viewed as anti-Pakistan, even though that's not a fair assessment, and that might not be the intention of Washington. That's how it will be viewed, because there's no real tangible alternative being offered. So I think that's going to be on the Biden administration to devise a tangible alternative that doesn't replace CPEC, because that's a fantasy, but complements CPEC, and perhaps offers improved models. So I think there's areas for China and the US to work together on, and there's also areas where the US should be leading by example rather than working with the Chinese. And that should, Pakistan is a perfect place to explore those opportunities.
Well, thank you. I have a few more questions. I'm going to defer them now because we've got a lot of great questions that have appeared in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start posing a few of those. And Andrew, I'll go to you. There are a few China-related questions that I'll pose to you, but the others should feel free to weigh in as well if they'd like. A few very different types of questions about China. The first one is how open is China to welcome companies, investments, and people from Pakistan? So we've talked a lot about Chinese investment in Pakistan. What about Pakistani investment in China? And then a security-related question that looks to the future. What do you think China's role may be in Afghanistan when the U.S. and NATO leave Afghanistan? Would China get militarily involved to prevent ISIS from finding a home in Afghanistan? So do you want to take a crack at those, Andrew?
Sure. Well, I'll say what I can about that. So, I mean, you've already seen, I suppose, on China's part, some of the kinds of, I mean, there's what China's doing on the multilateral or plurilateral level when it comes to Afghanistan, the peace process, all of these sorts of things, and then there's what's shifted bilaterally in recent years, including on the counterterrorism agenda. And there you have seen something that is a quasi-military role already, but in keeping with the way that China thinks about Afghanistan, it's a very, very narrowly conceived one, because still, I think the assessment is, yes, there are some of these wider groups that are matters of concern, but there are a specific list of groups that China cares about and will zero in with all efforts with all other parties to try and focus on them. So I mean, this talk about Chinese security around things, it's almost as if China would sort of step in to be part of a broader group that would help to stabilize. I mean, I struggle to see that kind of thinking there on the Chinese side. And we've seen what it's amounted to in the recent period in Badakhshan specifically, which is where, as far as China understands, there is some degree of TIP leadership operating out of there, and we have, it is one of the sort of unusual cases where you have seen what look like Chinese soldiers, even if they're people's own police, actually kind of present for counterterrorism operations in a foreign country. I mean, it is kind of an unusual case in that regard. I mean, I think that the sense still, though, is China's going to be very, very cautious about the aftermath, and again, even more so than it used to be. I think there was a point where it was kind of more forward-leaning about the sort of economic role that it might have had. You still get all of these reports of the content of meetings with the Taliban and others talking about sort of enlarged economic and investment role that China might play. Certainly, all of my discussions with Chinese interlocutors in the last 2 or 3 years suggest that there's a kind of leaning back on that there's a sort of that there's less of this peace dividend talk. There's more of a sense of we will really have to give this time before we're confident, and that's not, as I say, just about the internal political context. It does make a difference if you are operating in a context of intensifying US-China rivalry, how secure China feels about moving ahead with some of these things. I think that does play into some of these considerations as well. I mean, there is still a view on the Chinese side that I think goes quite deep, that Afghanistan is kind of purely seen through the prism of risk and threat, and on multiple fronts. You could be dragged in, it's a set of security threats, you have to be careful about the scope of your involvement, all of these sorts of things. I don't think that's gone away. I think there's going to be a very, very cautious approach to it. There is an understanding, and there has been, I think, going back a decade now nearly, that given the proximity and given the special role that China is able to play, it will have to kind of step up beyond what it used to do, where it was really kind of third or fourth tier actor there. But that's going to be still primarily diplomatic, to a limited degree, very narrow kind of security role of the sort that we've seen in the last period of time, and then economic, if possible. And it's just qualitatively different in terms of a view that says in Pakistan there is seen to be some kind of long-term stabilizing benefit from China's perspective to a greater economic role there, and it's supposed to sort of help. In one sense, it's sort of you step up economically with a view to helping to bring those outcomes about. The view in Afghanistan is the other way around. It's that without stability there, you can't take certain sorts of economic risks there in a way that China was maybe willing to do further back in time. So I think it's going to be quite limited in nature. Very much more briefly on the obverse piece of the Pakistan-China kind of economic relationship. It has, of course, been at times harder for Pakistani business people to get visas and things like that. There's still a degree of skepticism that's there among a lot of the Chinese, institutionally up and down the line, but particularly among the economic institutions when it comes to a lot of the interactions with Pakistan on this. The space generally has opened up between the two sides. I mean, it used to be a much more kind of narrowly confined relationship. You're seeing on multiple different fronts, not just on the economic and commercial side, but intellectually, culturally, there is somewhat more space being opened up, but there's still some kind of caution there on China's part when it comes to China's quite happy to accelerate its presence in Pakistan. I'm not necessarily sure that it's institutionally as comfortable with a kind of comparable escalation in Pakistani even business presence in China.
Okay, so there are a few questions that get into the geopolitics of CPEC, broadly speaking. A few queries asking about India, asking about Iran, how they play into this. And there was one particularly representative question that I'll read aloud, and I would welcome your thoughts. For the last few years, there seemed to be growing competition between a China-Pakistan axis around CPEC and an Indo-Iranian one around Chabahar port in Iran. Now CPEC and Chabahar are both delayed, but China and Iran are in talks over a strategic relationship that would give China a stake in Chabahar. Does China view Iran as a source of leverage with Pakistan? And are there any further thoughts from panelists, especially on the impact of the possibility of reopening US-Iran relations? A lot packed into that question. It's a good one. Anyone want to respond?
I can take a crack, Michael.
Yeah, go ahead. And Adam, I know, yeah, so you could go ahead and start, Ammara, please.
Thank you. And I first quickly want to address your earlier question that I missed on RCEP. From the Pakistani perspective, I think Pakistan is not positioned really economically to be taking a very proactive stance on it. Pakistan may wish to be part of that alliance, but Pakistan's economy needs to be of a certain level and certain capability before that regional bloc can take Pakistan as a serious player. That said, I think at the moment Pakistan's study of RCEP is more towards understanding it from the great power competition prism that is unfolding between the US and China. And I think that's a developing story, as we say in journalism. And I think that's all from the Pakistan's perspective. On the comparison between CPEC and Chabahar, I think the developments in the last 1 year, in my view, it makes it very clear that you at this point in time, those comparisons are falling short. I think the geopolitical and security questions around US and around Iran itself are very different from the geopolitical and security questions around Pakistan and CPEC. And again, I'd reiterate that I do not agree with the view that CPEC has stalled. No, CPEC has gone through a readjustment phase. And I think one of the big new factors that Pakistan and China are calibrating at the moment is to see how there could be linkages with any potential dividends of the Afghanistan peace process, what with the whole new, thought and policy momentum around regional connectivity. And so, Afghanistan getting kind of a green light to be using Gwadar port for the transit trade, I think that's a big indicator most recently of how Pakistan and China would definitely have an edge over, Chabahar port in terms of its, near-term functionality and near-term operationability for Afghanistan. I think when it comes to Chabahar in Iran, I think from my perspective, the most important question, and I know that this is a big consideration for the incoming Biden administration, is to decide or to take up a certain resolution towards Iran's nuclear status and the fate of JCPOA and how the Biden administration is positioning itself to enter into a possible rapprochement with Iran. And so I think it doesn't have to be a course of competition between the two tracks. I think if you look at the recent traffic between Islamabad and Tehran, there seems to be a greater emerging convergence and understanding on how Pakistan and Iran are going to be more collaborated and coordinated on their responses towards the Afghanistan peace process. There is this talk about, Pakistan playing a potential role of a mediator between, on behalf of Iran vis-a-vis the West and the US. So there are all these considerations where I do not think that the paradigm of pitting Chabahar against CPEC is going to hold water in the near term or the long term. If Pakistan and China are able to, and I agree with Adam that there's tremendous opportunity for cooperation. In my perspective, it's not just up to the US to explore those windows of opportunities. I think Pakistan and China are would be equally, I think, open to exploring those windows of cooperation. And I think Iran definitely opens that immediate first window of opportunity, decidedly from a nuclear perspective. But I think that has tremendous scope for converting that convergence into some level of functional regional cooperation between the US, China, and Pakistan playing a facilitative role.
If I could
go ahead, Adam.
I defer to Ammara's what she said about the competition between Chabahar and CPEC, and I should note that I believe Dr. Barnett Rubin, who's also a non-resident senior fellow at Quincy Institute, has a publication coming out about this imminently. So I'd follow his feed to look out for that. That explores just this issue, including China's efforts to possibly connect Chabahar to the north-south transportation corridor and BRI. From the U.S. policy perspective, I think the Chabahar port project offers a really good metaphor for the cost of trying to silo our policies in the region. U.S. sanctions shut down that project, which was Indian-led, and it would have been beneficial for security and economic development in Afghanistan. And Secretary Pompeo and the Trump administration made assurances that there'd be exceptions for Chabahar in order to appease India. But the fact is that developers and companies are risk averse. So when you have a sanction, it has a chilling effect that goes far beyond the text of the sanction or the specific impact of the sanction. And I'm not a sanctions expert, but too often times when we discuss sanctions in Washington, we use legalese and we discuss their intent and exactly how they would be implemented in a perfect world. But companies don't want to touch sanctioned countries. They just don't. So, and I do think that the Trump administration understood that, and it's intended to have a chilling effect. But the cost of that is that it undermines our other objectives in the region. So you can't, I think BRI still presents an opportunity for the United States, but if you don't believe it presents an opportunity and you think BRI is a threat to the United States, you can't truly take that position without accepting that our focus on Afghanistan was a liability, because if you think we should remain in Afghanistan, but BRI is also a threat, those are conflicting positions, because essentially we can't have it all. So I think we're going to have to improve our relations with Iran to have a positive outcome in Afghanistan. There's no way around it.
Thank you. And I think one could argue that the region, South Asia, would certainly benefit from a better US-Iran relationship, though certainly events of recent days will compound the challenges for the incoming Biden administration on that front. I wanted to take the direction a bit more into the future, sort of taking a forward outlook about what to expect, or what we might expect for investment patterns in the region from China. And I would pose the question to the three of you. So, I guess, Andrew, if you could take your crystal ball out and tell us what you see in terms of what we might expect Chinese investment to look like in Afghanistan and Pakistan down the road, keeping in mind there's all the tremendous levels of uncertainty, particularly in the Afghanistan context. I recognize it's hard to predict, but just some general thoughts about what we might look for, what we could see down the road. And Ammara, on that front, do you think that Islamabad could start looking to other of its partners, other than China, to step up commercial partnership? Turkey is a country that we hear a lot about in this context, in terms of its friendship with Pakistan, a longstanding one that has strengthened in recent years. And then I guess for Adam, coming back to the U.S. If you were to think about the prospects for U.S. Investment footprint in South Asia, broadly speaking, not just Afghanistan and Pakistan, I know that you and I both agree that it's important not to get stuck in the so-called AfPak rut. That I think it's important to think about South Asia as a broader geographic entity. So, the Trump administration has come out with its Indo-Pacific policy, and it's a series of tools and institutions that accompany it, like this new Development Finance Corporation, Blue Dot Network, all of which are meant to promote new US-sponsored infrastructure investments in cooperation with partners in the broader Indo-Pacific region, including potentially South Asia. So just wanted to hear if you wanted to weigh in as to whether the Biden administration may pick up on some of those new tools in those new institutions. But we'll start with you, Andrew, if you take out your crystal ball and talk a bit about what you could anticipate in the future.
So, I mean, in one sense, I've kind of answered somewhat on Afghanistan already. I think it's going to be slow, stalled, cautious in many ways on China's part for a while to come. I think you have to kind of step away and look at what's going on the Belt and Road as a whole, though, because in one way, some of these are kind of subsets of that kind of broader trajectory of what's happening, even if there are some very particular features, especially with CPEC. I mean, generally speaking, right now, I mean, even before we were going into the pandemic and the current economic context, there'd been kind of a tapering back. There'd been a move away from the kind of speed and scale that you got in the early years, partly as China went through a whole series of the experiences that it did in terms of I mean, it got burned in a number of places. One of them was Pakistan. I mean, we can say that CPEC has or has not stalled or something like that. I mean, I've spoken to lots of the Chinese officials who were not happy about where things moved. Some things have been stabilized again there, but it was undoubtedly one of the cases where, as with a series of other iterations, they ran into a set of problems that they had not fully anticipated in the first instance and have recalibrated their sense of economic and political risk as a result of that. And that's going on across the board. And we're seeing that in the numbers on the BRI. And that was happening before the pandemic. With the pandemic, we're now seeing a situation in which they're dealing with a series of debt renegotiations virtually across the whole swathes of the developing world. This is taking place on a very significant scale. The lending institutions are worried about that and are kind of struggling to deal with that. There are investments that made sense in the prior economic context that don't make as much sense in the current one. There are other twists to it. I actually think that there's been more fiscal room to move ahead on supporting some new projects just for stimulus purposes in certain countries. We've seen that in certain African contexts. We've seen that to a certain extent with CPEC, where actually some things are moving forward now that were not moving forward even in February, for instance. I think it's so important reputationally now, the Belt and Road and CPEC, that there will be a willingness on China's part to make certain commitments, even if only for the sake of saying that it is successful. I mean, it becomes difficult even to talk about things like CPEC is stalling or something like that, because the reputation around these things, it's sufficiently politically charged in lots of these contexts, and China is so invested in the reputational outcomes that relate to this. But I still see a willingness politically, in the same way that you saw willingness in the early days with CPEC to just have that extra kind of push from the top to make things happen from Xi Jinping. I still see that push there in various contexts to say, we have to get past certain obstacles. It matters too much that this is seen to be a success. This is too personally tied to Xi Jinping. The BRI is too important to be seen to fail. And so I think politically there will continue to be momentum to move ahead on all sorts of fronts. And that will certainly be the case with CPEC. But there was a period that it looked like that, and this period that starts to look like that on some of these things. I think the level of expectations on China's part of what can be achieved with any of this has just dropped a lot. The kind of grand developmental objectives that it might have had in the first instance, I think it understands are not possible anymore. So inevitably, I think we are going to see all of this proceed on a somewhat slower and more careful trajectory than we saw in the past.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Ammara, let's go to you. Your final thoughts about the future, particularly in terms of Pakistan's potential investment relationships with countries besides China.
So on that, Andrew, Michael, my quick response is that I think Pakistan, even before President Ghani's statement from a couple of weeks ago that Afghanistan wants connectivity and not charity, I think Pakistan said trade, not aid, about 10 years ago. And I think this is Islamabad's #1 priority, to shift away from a development assistance paradigm to very active commercial and investment partnerships with all countries of the world, including the US, which remains Pakistan's #1 export destination. And China is Pakistan's #1 import destination. So that kind of imbalance Pakistan is very conscious of. And what Andrew refers to as stalling, I think the difference of trade imbalance between China and Pakistan has been a sticking point of negotiation in these last couple of years, which ostensibly slowed or stalled the process. I think there's some hardcore negotiation that has gone on into the bilateral relationship as to how to turn CPEC relatively more advantageous for Pakistan's commercial interests, Pakistan's economic interests, and not, predominantly China. And I think that's a conversation, from my perspective, will deepen more and more. But again, it depends on and on Turkey. My view is actually Turkey is a commercial competitor for Pakistan in the region, rather than as a very active trade partner, because given similar capabilities, I think this is the region which has emerged as the big market. I think Pakistan and Turkey would be competing for Central Asian markets, for Afghanistan markets, for Chinese markets. So I think that's another area that I'd watch out for. I think there's a larger point which I feel imperative to make. All this conversation on commercial progression, on economic development and growth, which I'm a big aficionado for, I think it really depends on an immediate and to long-term security and regional stability of the region. I think unless and until there's a very clear-cut political settlement in Afghanistan towards sustainable peace, unless there are preemptive measures against role of spoilers to the peace process, unless the larger security questions are settled, between the regional powers, and that includes India and Pakistan. I think this conversation of economic growth will remain vulnerable to this very strong and traditional historical dynamic of violence and regional proxies in the region. I think it's imperative, and in my view, I'm going to say something that I've thought about a lot. I think if you look at China's, despite the Ladakh standoff, if you look at China's with India, if you look at China's recent statement on the escalation of LOC crossfire between India and Pakistan, it's a very restrained, very regional big brother asking both to restrain and to work towards dialogue. For me, that offers another potential window of cooperation between the US and China, how both can work towards bringing Pakistan and India to the table for dialogue, because the risk of nuclear conflagration, India with Iran, it's just too big. And I think in order for the northern and the western questions to move towards economic growth, it is imperative that there's an overall environment of regional security and peace, and in some level of resolution between India and Pakistan, so that it doesn't the negative dynamic of that relationship doesn't cause a negative shadow on the overall framework of cooperation that we're talking about.
Thank you very much. Hard to disagree. A great vision. Tough to implement, but certainly worth thinking about. So, Adam, why don't you go ahead and provide a last word in terms of potential future for U.S. investment prospects in South Asia, broadly speaking?
I'll speak briefly, since I think we're almost up out of time. But when I looked at Secretary Pompeo's public statements during the U.S.-India 2+2 ministerial dialogue and his tour of South Asia, and they were very focused on China, not too focused on South Asia. So I guess I'd close with that there's opportunities for diplomacy and economic development in South Asia, in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan. The United States can use the mechanisms that it has to engage in traditional development work. It can facilitate private sector development with US companies leading the way. And it can also help promote trade between Afghanistan and Pakistan and India and Afghanistan, and try to do so in a way that reduces trade imbalances. For example, the trade imbalance that exists between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, it's probably not in a position to facilitate the integration of Iran into these trade relationships, but it can stop acting as a spoiler to the integration of Iran into those trade relationships, which would help stabilize Afghanistan and the region. So I would leave it at that, which is that South Asia presents real opportunities for trade, diplomacy, and development for the United States.
Well, thanks. I think that's a great way to conclude. I really appreciate this conversation. I learned a lot. I thank you all for participating. I'm going to turn things over to Kelly for just a second to wrap up. Very quickly, shameless self-promotion. If the audience is interested in these issues, Chinese investment in Afghanistan and Pakistan, tomorrow the Wilson Center will be hosting an event looking at clean energy prospects, or the prospects for clean energy projects in CPEC. That'll be tomorrow at 9 a.m. in Washington. You could watch it on wilsoncenter.org. Thank you very much. And Kelly, turn things over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for moderating that brilliant discussion. It was so high level and so impressive. Thank you, Andrew, Ammara, Michael, and Adam in particular for bringing all of these great minds together. And obviously, Quincy, thanks you all. I just wanted to mention before I go, before we finalize here, we have two great events coming up for Quincy. On Friday, Quincy will be awarding Congresswoman Barbara Lee with our first ever award for responsible statecraft for her principled positions against war and for congressional war powers. That'll be happening on Friday at 5:30, and it will be led by our president, Andrew Bacevich. Next Wednesday, I will be leading a discussion on a very provocative question, which entails, if we have the most powerful military on earth, the US that is, why can't we win wars? I'll be joined by Mark Perry, our Quincy Senior Fellow, as well as Mandy Smithberger from the Project on Government Oversight, as well as Daniel Davis from Defense Priorities. You can check out all of these events and more at our website under the events page. And thank you so much to our audience and for your wonderful questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we hope to see you soon in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for joining.
Thank you all. Terrific discussion.
Yeah,
That sounds like a good.
Fantastic.
Yes, indeed. The hour always goes by too fast.
Michael, thank you for your excellent moderation.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. But I had the easy part. I got to listen to all of your great comments. Yeah, terrific. And this event you're going to be doing on the U.S. military sounds very interesting as well.
Yeah, I think it'll be another case of an hour going by too fast because there are just so many different facets about military policy and where things can go wrong in the military industrial complex. But yeah, I think it'll be quite interesting. And I was really impressed with the comments and the questions that were coming in the Q&A box. They were, they're just one after the other. I realized we didn't have enough time to get to them all, but they all seemed pretty well informed.
Yeah,
They were really, yeah. They were great questions, and indeed, I wish I could have gotten to all of them, but I tried to get to as many as I could.
Yeah, it's really difficult when you have an hour. I've found, because you have a set of questions that you want to ask the panelists, and then you say, "Oh, I'll just splice in the Q&A," and it never seems to be enough time to do that. And then some of the questions will take you on different tangents and follow-ups, and next thing you know, you run out the clock.
Right, exactly. Great.
Ammara, what time is it in Islamabad? I know you joined us very late.
It's 11:23, I
So
think. It's 11:05.
I've always found in Pakistan people stay up late, so I'm sure we still got viewers. But thank you for being on air with us so late.
I wouldn't have missed it for the world. Thank you for the opportunity. Fantastic discussion.